today, like the first presentation is by Margarita. She is from Subvisual, which is actually, I think, one of the largest companies, crypto companies, founded and based here in Portugal, in Braga, building very interesting technology. And today you will talk about a very important topic, which is the funding of public goods. And I think that's obviously a super important topic in this space. I think it's kind of, we have always this tragedy of commons, like who's actually responsible for funding the most fundamental infrastructure, and mostly no one really wants to. So I'm quite excited to hear like how you think we can solve this.
Let's go. It's exactly about this. It's going to be about incentives, guys. Okay, so we're going to talk about funding public goods and the importance of reframing the incentives that we have for funding public goods. First, let's start with a little bit about me. This is all you need to focus on for right now. I love discussing new ideas, but I panic being in moments exactly like this. So I am panicking through this whole presentation. Stay with me. Basically, things about myself. I am co-founder of Portugal FinTech, which is an association in Portugal that has been trying and started with the mission of joining traditional finance with fintech, intratech, and redtech startups. We now have a co-working space as well called the FinTech House. I helped organize ETH Lisbon as well. Diogo, one of the main organizers, is over there, passing the attention to him. And I work for Subvisual, which is a consultancy company exclusively working with Web3 that is 10 years old. And we also are part venture studio. Other things about me that are unrelated to this is I like rollerblading, I like journaling, and I like being vulnerable in situations like this, even if it goes wrong at the end. Okay, guys, so what are public goods? Public goods are typically qualified by being non-rivalrous and non-excludable. By non-rivalrous, what I mean is when one person uses the good, it does not prevent others from doing so. So air. Me breathing air does not prevent you from breathing air, right? Non-excludable means that it's usually costly or impossible to exclude others from using it. Same as with air, right? You cannot exclude someone from breathing air. When we talk about public goods, especially in the Web3 area, we mention a lot of commons as well, that expression, which is often used interchangeably. And I'm going to use it interchangeably, but something that you need to focus on is that commons are rivalrous, right? A lot of these public goods, so clean water, clean air, scientific research, basic education, are also commons and can be or not rivalrous depending on the community that is providing them. Usually this is divided by country or state. Okay. So the funding of public goods is usually done by government agencies, private corporations, communities, private individuals, and NGOs. And the most common way of doing this is through grants or donations. And let's focus on grants and donations, the exact way that we do this for a while, because it matters a lot and it's part of the problem that I'm gonna talk about. So what's the problem here with grants and donations? Grants and donations propagate the lack of incentives for private entities to invest in public goods. This is what I'm advocating today. And I'm also advocating that finding a way to co-design, collaborate, and co-think these incentives is really important, and we need to find a bridge for it. So usually, the lack of incentives for private entities to enter the impact market is that the positive externalities are usually mostly measured long term. We don't have a lot of efficacious methods to really understand how building a massive infrastructure project like high-speed railways will benefit you in 1 year, okay? Or providing free education to children from ages of 1 to 5. Basically, how you measure the positive externalities of that usually takes decades. And this is something that we also need to fix. Okay. How can blockchain help with this? So blockchain can help with this through smart contracts, tokenization, reputation systems, and DAOs. But basically, this all measures up to infrastructure. I believe that infrastructure is the most important part that blockchain has to play in this. So, for instance, infrastructure provided by blockchain can basically increase transparency, accountability, traceability, and flexibility in between all the users that are part of funding a public good mechanism. And we're going to talk about those in a bit. This infrastructure allows us to co-design, collaborate, and coordinate. So smart contracts can help us, for instance, automate allocations of capital depending on metrics, if they are reached or not. They can also flexibilize fund distribution. Tokenization can allow for ownership, participation, being a new source of liquidity as well, and automation of regulatory processes. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example, carbon credits being used through NFTs, and all of the legal information that needs to be provided is in the metadata, for instance. We can also create reputation systems. So the credibility and the trustworthiness of a lot of public good projects depend on reputation systems. And we can help use blockchain and to guarantee that people who contribute to good projects with good outcomes are recognized for it and publicly done so. DAOs are very, very helpful to pool funds from multiple donors and democratize decision-making in the funding processes. All of these structures allow for a multitude of tailoring for different areas of public goods funding, and this is very, very necessary. I'm going to give you some use cases of public goods funding in the blockchain space. So 2 of these are very, very famous. So Optimism and Gitcoin, they run quadratic funding rounds. Vita DAO is a very interesting use case as well. Basically what they do is they have a pool of funders that vote on proposed longevity research to fund. And then Protocol Labs is, I put it there, they are the less known example, but they have a very, very famous project going on that is HyperCerts. And they've been trying to create this whole structure that I'm talking about with blockchain. And they're currently trying to do that. And they've been doing it via not quadratic funding, but quadratic voting. And this quadratic voting has been implemented in impact evaluators, where they have people from the Protocol Labs network evaluate projects that contribute to the Protocol Labs network the most, and then retroactively fund them. So I gave all of these examples because I think they all have a problem. It's not criticism, and I read everything about these projects. I really, really believe in them. And I think they're very transparent in actually marking the errors that they make and how they twitch things from one session to the next. But I think that the biggest problem for me is something that's missing. I think that all of these projects are missing the tying of impact with revenue. Okay? So basically, what happens is most of these projects are retroactive funding. So what happens? The team works on something that is for the benefit of a network, and then that network retroactively funds the team for their work if the work is valued enough. The problem with this is that, firstly, all of these successful experiments, they mostly focus around one area, which is open source software. So no one is really trying to find an answer to public goods funding using blockchain for other areas, such as education and etc. And the question is, how do we expand these incentive mechanisms so that we can expand it to other areas? And I believe that it's exactly this point that's missing. So tying impact and revenue. Tying these will allow for incentive alignment between all the players that are part of a public goods funding cycle. And this will allow us to access larger pools of funds, larger scale projects, because if you see at what's going on now, we have some projects that have up to 3 million in funding, which sounds really, really nice. But if we want to create freshwater infrastructure, it's going to take around $10 billion. So how do we pool funds for this? Who do we go to? How do we incentivize privates to invest in public goods and actually understand the value that they have? And this is all about users. I'm a product manager, right? So user testing is my thing, and user analysis as well. So let's talk about incentives and who the users are. So the users are government agencies and NGOs. I've pulled them together because the value capture that they take from public goods funding is under the umbrella of the optimized continuance of society, right? They don't necessarily need to have a profit. They aren't looking for a profit. They're looking for an ROI that is mostly social. Then we have traditional corporations, and by this you can understand any type of big pharma or an investment bank, any traditional large company. Their value capture umbrella is usually optimized return on investment profits, right? If they do invest. Then you have VCs, and the value capture for VCs is return on investment profits. And then you have the talent, which is fundamental and most people forget about. So all of the researchers are all of the people that are trying to innovate within the public goods space in guaranteeing that all of these public goods incentives are actually being created. So their value capture umbrella is on impact. So they want to guarantee that their impact of their work is measurable, and they want to guarantee that they have the right financial incentives to work. This is why, for me, retroactive funding is sometimes a problem. It's because teams are working without cash flow and just on the hope that they might get funded later. And this is a big problem for people who want to fund research, who need to have expensive resources and materials to work, such as, for instance, if you want to do scientific research in a lab. This requires a lot of money, a lot of resources, and retroactive public funding usually isn't enough to guarantee that. All of these also have very different profiles, right? So if we think about governments, they don't mind if they measure their success by how better their society becomes, but they don't have anything to lose, right? They don't have to answer, they have to answer to the people, but they don't have to answer to stakeholders. Corporations and VCs, they work in very different ways, so we need to consider incentives for them as well. So, for instance, for corporations, something that you might consider an incentive is to leverage a complement for their core business. So if you're talking about a manufacturing company that has their own shipping system, for instance, or if you're thinking about FedEx or something like this, an example of a complement to their core business is having them invest in high speed railways, which will then later on increase their efficiency and lower their costs in comparison to using trucks and gas, right? So this is the type of incentive that I'm talking about for them. VCs are very much break things. So they're high risk, high upside, they're innovation focused, and they're prepared to help something scale. This is also fundamental because what you have to give back to VCs as an incentive is very different than what you have to give to a corporation or to a government, right? So what you want to guarantee as an incentive for a VC is probably that with their initial capital, they will get quick returns. Even if they're not their highest returns, they will still get returns. And then talent. What we want to guarantee is that we get the best teams and the best talent for the right amount of money. They're well compensated and they can measure their value long term. So now I'm going to give you an example of how this works in the real world. So an example of how this could be set up is we have a funding pool here in the middle. We have 3 different funders. So the government agencies and NGOs, corporations, and VCs. They all put money into the funding pool. This funding pool can be for a clean water initiative. They all put money in the funding pool. Then the money is distributed proactively, not retroactively, to talent. And talent comes up with an output. And then what? This is what we're missing right now. Okay, so when the output comes out, usually you take years to measure the benefits that the output gave you, and you take years to actually get any type of monetary value from them back. So how does this work in the future for corporations and VCs that want to invest their money? An example is this. So this is what you need to consider in terms of incentive alignment for them to actually see that benefits exist. So the output, what it's going to bring to the different players is the following. So for talent, it's going to bring impact capture, peer recognition, trust and credibility in their work, continued funding, and resources for them to continue doing their jobs. For government agencies and NGOs, it's all about impact capture, guaranteeing sustainability, guaranteeing and increasing the quality of life and economic growth, increasing social equity, and actually benefiting from more political support. So for corporations, it's return on investment profits, a complement for their core business, reduced costs in the future. So this is thought long term. Regulatory compliance, corporate social responsibility, which is something very relevant in terms of perception nowadays, and even tax benefits. So these are all the incentives we need to consider in our blockchain mechanism to guarantee that these players are eager to come in. And then for VCs, it's pretty similar. It's return on investment profits, access to new markets, a competitive advantage as well, tax benefits, and corporate social responsibility as well. Here's a pretty successful example that's been going on for a while. It's called Pay for Success Retroactive Public Goods. And this is a case of funding for drug repurposing. I don't know if you guys are familiar with drug repurposing, but basically, if you have paracetamol, right? Paracetamol was studied and was approved by the FDA, for instance, or the European Union. It came out and it was under IP, right? and they sold it as Benuron initially, from Ben Pharmaceuticals. And what they never thought to do, it became pretty obvious what the uses for Benuron are. So you have a headache, you take one. You have a fever, you take one. But what most people don't know is that the most important studies done by pharma companies are on how to repurpose a drug. Because drugs that are existing nowadays in the system that have been approved, that don't need years of research and regulation to actually come out, can be used for a lot of different things. So you might actually find 4 different uses and applicabilities for Benuron. So what happens in this case? In this case, retroactive public goods funding makes sense, guys. So an impact investor provides upfront capital to a research team. This is why the retroactive part is okay in this instance. It's because the team is provided with upfront capital. So the research team conducts randomized trials to try and understand if there is any other use for Benuron. And then there's a success payer. The success payer are usually big pharma, okay? So what they want to do is they want to buy these clinical trials that were done for cheap, and they would have to spend a lot more money doing them. And they want to file for new IP for the same drug. This is what can happen, right? And this is a true incentive for them. And so the success payer comes in, it buys the research results, and then the money is given back to the research team and the impact investor. And I also have a medal there because it also goes to reputation and credibility in this sense. So it's also something that is given when a success payer actually pays for your research that was already done. Now, a question for another day after this example is, I don't have enough time, but that was, so those types of trials are already being run by Molecule, for instance. They're already doing this. And they've had some successful cases of bias, which is a really good sign that they've been able to actually incentive big corporations to invest in public goods. And the question that I have now is, how do we manage this pool of value-aligned capital so all of these 3 different players that are governments, NGOs, corporations, and VCs, with a supply of projects and teams that are wanting to study and research public goods, how do we join them together, and how do we create a system and an infrastructure that guarantees that they get that is flexible enough to set up funding from one to the other, guaranteeing the flexibility that each of them will get the incentive that they actually need. So this is it, guys. A question for another day, or if someone wants to talk to me about this afterwards.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
All right. So this is more of a comment. So I've thought about all. Well, no. It's all good. So I've thought about all the concepts in here before. This is really, really cool. The one thing that I hadn't thought about before, and I really like the way that you framed, is the concept around talent and them not knowing whether their work is valuable. Because that's something that really hit home for me, because I used to work for nonprofits in politics. And one of the things that was the most painful was like, it's not just the talent that doesn't know if they're being helpful with the work that they're doing, but it's the managers. And if the managers don't know how to assess value, then they make shit up. And like the thing that was so painful was like just getting random like metrics that the managers were like, okay, let's assess value this way based on some made up stuff in their head, because it's so hard without market forces, without revenue or things like that, to know whether you're adding value. So I think this is really, really cool, and yeah, that's all.
You want to comment on it?
Oh, I was just going to say that I know your pain. I've also done a lot of work for NGOs. And actually, if you want to research this, you should check out the Hypersearch Foundation. They have a way, and they have been studying how to use blockchain to basically run the metrics on chain. For instance, one really good example is the farming industry. So, yeah.
Yeah, I also thought it was really spot on because if you think about like probably the smartest people are researching of how to do the next like filter for TikTok instead of actually solving real problems, because it's a much easier way to actually turn it into a profit and get recognition. And I think that's definitely like a very important problem to solve. And it's also always surprising to me that obviously public goods is something that obviously everyone needs, and where you have the highest utility, or you can create the highest utility, and it's only because people fail to see how to monetize it that they are not willing to invest into it. A good example is even our own project, like Save, right? At the beginning when we created it, people were asking like, why do you do this? It's like a public good, like we fail to see how you can turn this into something that actually returns any value, and well, I guess it's still to be seen, but what changed a lot is the perception by VCs, and I think that's something that became much more obvious, at least for VCs in crypto, that public goods, because they're used literally by a lot of people everywhere, even if you find only one way to monetize it, it will eventually pay off. And I think that's something we can hopefully translate to other areas, as you mentioned. Yeah, I think one funny example where I'm not sure it was solved properly is actually here the bridge that you all cross probably a couple of times. The bridge, like the Golden Gate bridge of April 25th, right? Which actually has been built by like a private investor, like a private company. And in return, they get all your toll payments that you do for a very long period of time. So that's like another way how the government kind of decided, we cannot spend this money, but we give it to you, and in return you earn like the tolls everyone's paying. I'm pretty sure it was a corrupt decision, but it was just another way to fund like a public good, and I'm pretty sure whoever did this paid off very well. Yeah, anyways.
One comment. Thank you very much. Absolutely agree with you on incentives. I worked between VCs, governmental agencies, and corporates on utilities. So think water, think electricity, public infrastructure. It's a pain. I would add to your presentation that we all must be aware of the different decision-making processes. All of them are very, very different. And if you manage to convince one party, let's say a VC, you manage to convince a corporate, it will take you one more year to convince the governmental agency that you want to work with. So, and because of that, quite often the public goods incentive fall apart. So awareness of decision-making processes. Yeah.
Also known as forget about governments. Let's go. Next one. Yeah. I was always
Thank you. That's great presentation.